She bought a ruined stone shack for $5. Heinrich Brauer, who had survived 11 Kansas winters, told her plainly, "You'll freeze in that pile of rocks, and those children will freeze with you." She had $5, 2 children, and needed a roof she had no idea how to build. On January 6, 1887, the temperature dropped 46 degrees in 12 hours. But 5 months earlier, Clara Vogel had never laid a single stone, cut a single sawed brick, or built anything larger than a chicken coop. The land office clerk in Russell, Kansas, looked up from his ledger when the woman walked in. It was August of 1886, and the drought had emptied half the claims in the county. Another widow looking to file, he assumed. They came through every few weeks now, clutching letters from dead husbands and asking about the 160 acres the government promised. But this one wasn't filing. Clara Vogel set $5 on the counter. Her dress was faded calico, mended at the elbows. 2 children stood behind her, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl no older than 5, both silent, both watching their mother with the wary attention of children who had learned not to ask questions. She wanted to buy the Hendricks ruin. The clerk blinked. The Hendricks place had burned 2 years prior. Some said a chimney fire. Others whispered about the man's debts and a convenient accident. Either way, the wooden roof had gone up like kindling, and what remained was a roofless limestone shell on the edge of town. 4 walls and nothing else. No door, no windows. Just stone bones bleaching in the Kansas sun. "Ma'am," the clerk said, "that property isn't fit for habitation." Clara Vogel did not move. "Is it for sale?" "Technically, but $5, that's what I have." The clerk glanced at the children. The boy had his hand on his sister's shoulder. The girl was sucking her thumb. "Winter's coming," the clerk said. "You understand that? Real winter, not like back east. Out here the cold kills." Clara Vogel kept her hand on the coins. "Is $5 enough?" The clerk hesitated. Then he reached for the deed. She had come from Pennsylvania with a husband who died of cholera in Missouri and a wagon that broke an axle in Salina. She had sold the oxen to pay for the wagon's repair, then sold the wagon to buy train passage west. By the time she reached Russell, she had $5, 2 children, and a carpet bag containing 1 spare dress, a Bible, and a photograph of a man who would never see Kansas. The Hendricks ruin sat 300 yards from the nearest neighbor, a soddy occupied by a German family named Brauer. Heinrich Brauer had survived 11 Kansas winters. He was the man the other settlers consulted when their wells went dry, or their crops failed, or their livestock sickened. He knew the land. He knew the weather. And the morning after Clara Vogel signed the deed, he walked over to tell her she had made a fatal mistake. She was standing inside the ruin when he arrived, her children picking through the rubble for anything salvageable. The stone walls rose 7 feet on all sides, blackened by smoke near the top where the fire had burned hottest. The floor was bare earth, packed hard by 2 years of rain and wind. Above them, the August sky stretched blue and merciless. "Mrs. Vogel," Heinrich Brauer said. He did not step inside. "I heard you bought this place." She turned. "Word travels fast. Small town." He looked at the walls, the missing roof, the children. "You understand what you've bought? This isn't a house. It's a grave waiting to happen." Clara wiped dust from her hands. "It has walls." "Walls don't keep you warm. You need a roof. You need fuel. You need food stores and water and—" He stopped, shaking his head. "A woman alone can't prepare for winter out here, not with 2 children to feed, not starting from nothing." "I'm not starting from nothing. I have walls." Heinrich Brauer's expression didn't change. "You have 8 weeks until first frost, 10 until hard cold. By January, it'll be 30 below, and the snow will be higher than your boy's head." He pointed at Thomas, who had stopped picking through rubble to listen. "You'll need 4 cords of wood minimum to survive until spring. Do you know how to cut timber, split logs, stack a cord?" Clara did not answer. "There's no timber within 15 miles of here anyway," Brauer continued. "Everything's been cut. You'd burn cow chips, except you don't have cattle. You'd burn hay, except you don't have land to cut it from." He lowered his hand. "I'm not saying this to be cruel, Mrs. Vogel. I'm saying it because I've seen what happens. I've seen children frozen in their beds because their parents thought they could make do. I've seen—" He stopped again. "Go back to Pennsylvania. Sell this ruin to some fool speculator. Take your children somewhere they won't die." The silence stretched. Clara's daughter Annika had found a piece of broken china in the rubble, a fragment of a plate, blue flowers on white. She held it up to show her mother. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Brauer," Clara said. "I'll manage." Heinrich Brauer looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward his soddy without another word. That night, Clara sat against the stone wall with her children pressed close on either side. The August heat had faded with the sun, and now the stones radiated the cold they had absorbed during the day. By morning, the temperature would drop further. In a month, it would drop further still. And in January, she did not let herself finish the thought. Thomas was asleep. Annika was almost asleep, her breathing slow and even against Clara's arm. Above them, the stars burned in the exposed sky. No roof, no protection, just 300 yards of open ground between them and the Brauers' soddy, and beyond that, nothing but prairie until the end of the world. $5. That was what she had spent. Every cent she owned in the world spent on 4 walls and a floor of packed earth. Heinrich Brauer was right. She didn't know how to cut timber. She didn't know how to stack a cord. She had grown up in Philadelphia, where coal came in bags, and winter meant putting an extra blanket on the bed. Her husband had known things. He'd grown up on a farm, had worked with his hands, but her husband was dead in a Missouri churchyard with a wooden cross that would rot within 5 years. She had 8 weeks, 4 cords of wood she could not cut, a roof she could not build, children she could not let die. Clara pulled Annika closer and stared at the stars and tried to think of a single way this could end in anything other than exactly what Heinrich Brauer had predicted. The idea came 3 days later, and it came from the walls themselves. Clara was hauling water from the town well, a quarter-mile each way, twice a day, the bucket heavy enough to make her shoulders burn, when she stopped to rest against the ruin's eastern wall. The sun had been up for hours. The air was thick with August heat, but the stone against her back was cool. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone. Cool, almost cold. In the middle of summer, in the middle of the day, the stone held the night's temperature like a promise. She thought of her grandmother's root cellar in Pennsylvania. Underground, insulated by earth, it stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. Not warm enough to live in, but warm enough to keep potatoes from freezing, warm enough to preserve meat through the cold months. The Hendricks ruin had walls 2 feet thick, limestone, heavy, dense. If she could cover those walls, trap the heat inside instead of letting it escape through a wooden roof, she looked up at the empty sky above the ruin. Not a wooden roof, a roof like the ground itself. Earth, sod. The same material the Brauers used for their walls but laid flat across heavy timbers. The idea was absurd. She had never built a roof. She had never cut sod. She did not have money for timbers or nails or any of the materials a real roof required. But she had 8 weeks. Clara set down the water bucket and walked inside the ruin. She stood in the center, turning slowly, measuring the space with her eyes. 16 feet by 20, 320 square feet. If she could find timber for a ridgepole, one heavy beam running the length, and smaller poles for rafters. She stopped turning. The Hendricks barn had burned too, but only the upper portion. The walls still stood entangled in the debris. She had seen timbers, charred at the ends, but solid, salvageable. One ridgepole, 12 rafters, maybe 15. A layer of brush across the top, then sod cut from the prairie. She did not know if it would work. She did not know if the weight would hold, if the sod would insulate, if any of this was anything more than the desperate fantasy of a woman with no other options. But she had 8 weeks, and Heinrich Brauer had given her nothing but certainty of death. Clara picked up the water bucket and walked back to her children. Chamo, Martha Lindstrom lived a half-mile north, in a frame house her husband had built before the drought drove him to drink himself to death. She was 43 years old, had buried 2 children and 1 husband, and had opinions about everything, which she shared freely with anyone who passed within speaking distance. Clara met her on the 4th day, while dragging a charred timber from the Hendricks barn toward the ruin. The timber was 8 feet long and heavier than anything Clara had ever lifted. She had managed 50 yards, a quarter of the distance, and her arms were shaking. "What in God's name are you doing?" Martha stood at the edge of the road, hands on her hips. Clara set down the timber. Her shoulders screamed. "Building a roof." "With burnt wood?" "The core is solid, just the outside is charred." Martha walked closer. She was a lean woman, weathered by sun and loss, and her eyes missed nothing. "You're the widow who bought the Hendricks place." "Clara Vogel." "I heard." Martha nudged the timber with her boot. "Heinrich Brauer says you'll be dead by February." "Mr. Brauer said January, actually." Something flickered in Martha's expression, surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect. "You planning to prove him wrong?" "I'm planning to build a roof." Martha looked at the timber, then at Clara's shaking arms, then at the ruin visible in the distance. "A roof out of what? Burnt beams and good intentions?" Clara wiped sweat from her forehead. "Sod, like the walls of a soddy, but on top." "Sod." Martha's tone went flat. "You know how much a sod roof weighs?" "No." 3 tons. Maybe more when it's wet. You're going to put 3 tons of earth on top of charred timber over stone walls? The walls are 2 feet thick. They'll hold. Will they? You know that for certain. Clara didn't answer. Martha shook her head. "I've seen sod roofs collapse and kill the families underneath. I've seen them leak so bad the floor turned to mud. I've seen—" She stopped. "You don't know what you're doing." "No," Clara said, "I don't, but I know what happens if I do nothing." The 2 women looked at each other across the charred timber. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called. "You'll need help," Martha said finally. "Not for me. I've got my own place to keep standing. But you'll need more than those 2 skinny arms." "I'll manage." "You keep saying that." Martha turned to go, then stopped. "The widow Schaefer, 2 miles east. Her husband died last spring. She's got a plow horse she can't afford to feed. Might trade labor for something. Might not." She walked away without looking back. Clara stood alone with the timber. Her arms had stopped shaking. They had moved past shaking into a numb heaviness that meant tomorrow would be worse. She bent down, gripped the wood, and dragged it another 50 yards toward the ruin. Edwin Polk arrived on the 6th day. He was a land speculator from Topeka, a man who bought distressed properties for pennies and sold them to desperate settlers for dollars. He wore a clean suit despite the August heat, and his boots were polished, and he smiled the way men smile when they know something you don't. Clara was cutting sod when he found her. She had borrowed the widow Schaefer's plow horse, not borrowed, exactly, but traded 3 days of labor for 3 days of use, and she was using a breaking plow to slice the prairie into strips. The sod came up in long ribbons, thick with root mass, heavy as stone. "Mrs. Vogel," Polk tipped his hat. "I understand you've purchased the Hendricks property." Clara did not stop working. The horse pulled, the plow cut. The sod curled back like skin peeling from muscle. "I'm prepared to offer you $8 for it," Polk continued. "Cash. Today. That's $3 more than you paid." "It's not for sale." Polk smiled. "Mrs. Vogel, I've been in this business for 15 years. I know desperation when I see it." He gestured at the half-built roof visible in the distance, the ridgepole in place now, the rafters going up one by one. "That isn't going to work. You know it. I know it. Every man in Russell knows it. When winter comes, you'll be just as dead as if you'd never started." Clara stopped the horse. She turned to face Polk directly. "Then why do you want it?" The smile flickered. "Excuse me? If I'm going to die and the roof won't work, why offer $8? Why offer anything?" Polk's smile returned, harder now. "Because the walls are good limestone. Someone will want them eventually. Might as well be me." "So you're betting I'll fail?" "I'm offering you a way out, Mrs. Vogel. Take the money. Take your children back east. Live." Clara studied him, the clean suit, the polished boots, the way his eyes kept moving to the ruin, calculating, appraising. "No," she said. "No? No." Polk's smile disappeared entirely. "You're a fool. You'll freeze to death in that pile of rocks, and those children will freeze with you, and I'll buy the property from the county for back taxes. $3, maybe $4. He stepped closer. "The only difference between now and then is that you'll be dead and I'll have paid less." Clara held his gaze. "Then I suppose you can wait." Polk stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward town, his polished boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. Clara watched him go. Then she picked up the plow handles, clicked her tongue at the horse, and went back to cutting sod. The ridgepole had taken 2 days to raise. It was a cottonwood trunk, 16 feet long and 8 inches thick at the narrow end. She had dragged it from a creek bed 3 miles away, using the widow Schaffer's horse and a rope harness she had improvised from an old bridle. The trunk gouged a trail through the prairie grass, a scar that would be visible until spring. Getting it onto the walls was the hardest thing Clara had ever done. She built ramps from rubble, broken limestone stacked at an angle against each end wall. She positioned the trunk at the base of one ramp, tied ropes to both ends, looped them over the top of the opposite wall, and pulled. The horse pulled. Thomas pulled, his 8-year-old arms straining until the veins stood out. Even Annika pulled, her small hands wrapped around the rope behind her brother. The trunk moved an inch, then another. Then it slipped backward and nearly crushed Clara's foot. They started again, and again, and again. By the end of the first day, the trunk was halfway up the ramp. By the end of the second day, it rested on top of the walls, spanning the full 16-foot width of the ruin. Clara's hands were blistered and bleeding. Her back felt like someone had driven a knife between her shoulder blades. But the ridgepole was in place. Rafters went faster. She cut cottonwood poles from the creek bed, 6 inches thick and 12 feet long, and laid them across the walls with their upper ends notched to rest against the ridgepole. 15 poles, spaced 18 inches apart. Each one was a day's work, cutting, dragging, lifting, securing. Each one brought her closer to something that might actually be called a roof. September arrived. The first frost came on the 14th, 2 days earlier than Heinrich Brauer had predicted. Clara woke to find ice crystals on the brush she had piled across the rafters, glittering in the dawn light like scattered diamonds. She had not finished the sod layer. She was perhaps halfway done, 160 square feet of prairie cut and stacked on the brush, 160 square feet still open to the sky. 2 weeks of work, 2 weeks more needed. The temperature that morning was 28 degrees. Charred. The widow Schaefer came on the last day of September. Her name was Margaret, and she was 71 years old, and she had crossed the Atlantic from Bavaria when she was 19. She had outlived 2 husbands, 6 children, and everyone who had ever told her what she could not do. She stood at the edge of the ruin and watched Clara lifting sod bricks onto the roof. Each brick weighed 50 pounds. Clara lifted them one at a time, climbing a ladder she had built from scrap lumber, placing them grass side down on the brush layer, then climbing back down for the next one. "How many more?" Margaret asked. Clara paused on the ladder. Her arms trembled. 60, maybe 70. "How long?" 4 days, if nothing goes wrong. Margaret nodded slowly. She walked to the pile of unplaced sod bricks, bent down, her back cracking audibly, and lifted one onto her shoulder. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Helping." Margaret carried the brick to the ladder's base. "You want to argue, or you want to finish before the snow comes?" Clara stared at her. "I can't pay you." "Did I ask?" Margaret set down the brick and went back for another. "My husband used to say, 'Talk less, work more.' Good advice. You should take it." They worked in silence until dark. Then they worked by lantern light until Clara's hands refused to grip the ladder rungs. In 9 hours, they placed 42 bricks. 28 more to go. The roof was finished on October 7th. Clara stood in the center of the ruin. She could not call it a ruin anymore. It was something else now, something that might have a chance, and looked up at the earthen ceiling above her. The sod bricks were packed tight, grass side down, with loose dirt filling the gaps. The brush layer beneath them was invisible, buried under 8 inches of prairie. The weight was enormous. She could feel it in the way the walls held themselves, in the slight compression of the mortar between the stones. 3 tons of earth pressed down on her improvised roof, held in place by nothing but gravity and the strength of charred timbers. Thomas and Annika stood beside her looking up. "Is it done?" Thomas asked. "Almost. I need a stove, and fuel, and food for the winter." "But the roof is done?" Clara put her hand on her son's shoulder. "The roof is done." Heinrich Brauer came by that evening. He walked a slow circle around the structure, examining the walls where they met the new roof, studying the pitch of the sod layer, looking for gaps and weaknesses. "It might hold," he said finally. Clara waited. "The problem isn't the roof." Brauer turned to face her. "It's what happens inside. You've got no stove, no fuel stockpiled, no food stores to speak of. Even if this pile of sod and stone holds together, you'll starve or freeze long before spring." "I'm working on that." "Working on it?" Brauer shook his head. "Mrs. Vogel, October's half gone. Winter could come any day. You don't have time to work on anything." "Then I'll work faster." He stared at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, but something adjacent to it. "There's a broken stove behind the Hendricks barn. Box stove, cracked firebox. I looked at it last year, thought about salvaging it. Decided it wasn't worth the trouble." "A cracked firebox?" "Iron cement would patch it. Maybe, if you can find any." He turned to go. "I still think you'll die, Mrs. Vogel, but at least you'll die trying." He walked back toward his soddy. Clara looked at her children. Then she walked toward the Hendricks barn. The stove weighed 140 pounds and had a crack in its firebox the length of Clara's hand. She found it buried under collapsed roof beams, rusted but intact. The crack ran along the bottom edge of the combustion chamber, the hottest part, the part where fuel burned. Without repair, any fire she lit would leak flames and smoke into the room. With repair, iron cement. $2 a can at the general store. She had no dollars. Clara sat in the rubble of the barn and looked at the broken stove and tried to think. Martha Lindstrom's voice echoed in her memory. The widow Schaefer, 2 miles east. Her husband died last spring. She's got a plow horse she can't afford to feed. Margaret Schaffer had worked beside her for 9 hours without asking for anything in return. Now Clara needed to ask. She walked 2 miles east and found Margaret sitting on her porch, shelling beans into a wooden bowl. The old woman looked up as Clara approached. Back already? Roof fall down? No, the roof is holding. Margaret grunted approval. Then what? Clara explained. The stove, the crack, the iron cement she couldn't afford. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, the old woman set down her bowl and stood, joints popping like distant gunfire. My husband kept all kinds of things in the barn, she said. Half of them I never understood. Come look. They found the iron cement behind a barrel of rusted nails, 2 cans, unopened, the labels faded but legible. Margaret pressed both cans into Clara's hands. I can't take these without paying, Clara said. Then don't take them. Trade for them. I have nothing to trade. Margaret's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. You have hands. You have time. My barn roof leaks and I'm too old to fix it. She pointed toward a sagging structure 50 yards away. Come spring, you patch my roof. We're even. Clara looked at the cans in her hands. What if I don't survive until spring? Then I'll patch it myself and curse your ghost. Margaret turned back toward her porch. Go fix your stove, Clara Vogel. Stop wasting daylight. The stove was installed on October 19th. The firebox was patched. The stovepipe was run through a hole Clara had cut in the sod roof, and the first fire was lit at sunset. Clara, Thomas, and Annika sat on the packed earth floor and watched the flames dance behind the cracked mica window of the stove door. Heat radiated outward, real heat, the kind that sank into bones and loosened muscles that had been clenched against cold for weeks. The stone walls absorbed the warmth. Clara pressed her palm against the limestone and felt it growing warm under her hand, storing heat the way it had stored cold in August. It works, Thomas said. So far. Is this what winter will feel like? Clara pulled her son close. I don't know. We'll find out together. Outside, the October wind was picking up. The first hard frost had come 3 days ago. The second would come tonight. She could feel it in the way the air bit at exposed skin, in the way the sky had gone pale and hard as iron. Winter was coming, and all she had between her children and the cold was 4 stone walls, a sod roof, a patched stove, and whatever fuel she could gather before the snow made gathering impossible. She had perhaps 6 weeks. By November 1st, Clara had accumulated 3/4 of a cord of cottonwood, dragged from the creek bed, split with a borrowed axe, stacked against the eastern wall of her stone shelter. She had 2 wagon loads of dried cow chips, gathered from the prairie before the first snow, piled under a canvas tarp behind the structure. She had 40 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried beans, a small barrel of salt pork, and a sack of potatoes that would last until January if she rationed carefully. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. Heinrich Brauer came by on the 3rd of November, his breath pluming white in the morning air. He walked around the fuel pile, counting, calculating. 1.25 quarts, maybe, he said. Call it 3 months if you're careful. What happens in February? Clara didn't answer. The cow chips will help. Might get you another month. But April's still a long way off, Mrs. Vogel. He looked at the stone shelter, the sod roof dark against the gray sky. The roof's holding better than I expected. I'll give you that. But survival isn't just about shelter. It's about supplies. And you're short. I know. What are you going to do about it? Clara looked at her fuel pile, her food stores, her children playing in the frost-hardened grass. Survive anyway. Brauer shook his head. That's not a plan. That's a prayer. Then I'll pray. He walked away without responding. The first snow came on November 18th, 6 inches overnight, drifting to 2 feet against the north wall of the shelter. Clara woke to a world transformed, white and silent, the prairie erased. Inside the stone walls, under the sod roof, the temperature held at 42 degrees. The stove had burned through the night, fed every 3 hours by Clara's sleep-deprived hands. The fire was low now, embers glowing behind the mica window, but the walls radiated stored heat like living things. Thomas pressed his hand against the stone. It's warm, he said, wonder in his voice. The wall is warm. Clara nodded. The principle was working. The stone absorbed heat during the day, released it slowly at night. The sod roof trapped warm air inside instead of letting it escape. Even with a dying fire, even with 6 inches of snow outside, the shelter held warmth like a promise. But the fuel pile was already smaller than it had been. December brought cold that Clara had never imagined. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero on the 8th, 20 below on the 12th. The creek where she had cut cottonwood poles froze solid. The prairie vanished under 2 feet of snow, then 3, then 4. The world contracted to the space between her stone walls. The fuel pile shrank. 3/4 of a cord became half a cord. Half a cord became a quarter. The cow chips burned faster than the wood, giving less heat, requiring more frequent feeding. Clara's nights became an endless rhythm of waking, feeding the stove, checking her children's breathing, trying to sleep before the cycle began again. Martha Lindstrom stopped by on December 15th, wrapped in so many layers she looked twice her size. She carried a bundle under one arm. Corn cobs, she said, pushing through the low door Clara had built from salvaged planks. Got more than I need. No good for cooking, but they'll burn. Clara took the bundle. I can't. You can, and you will. Martha looked around the shelter, the warm walls, the sleeping children, the small stove that somehow kept death at bay. I'll be damned. It actually works. So far. So far. Martha nodded slowly. Heinrich Brauer says you'll run out of fuel by February. Says the math doesn't add up. Mr. Brauer has been predicting my death since August. He's not usually wrong. Martha pulled her wrappings tighter. But he's not always right either. My late husband used to say, mathematics can't account for stubbornness. He was a drunk and a fool, but he was right about that much. She left without saying goodbye. The corn cobs burned for 3 days. Christmas passed. New Year's passed. January arrived like a held breath, the air so cold it hurt to inhale, the sky a pale blue that promised nothing but more cold to come. Clara's fuel pile was nearly gone. She had perhaps 2 weeks' worth of wood and cow chips remaining, maybe 3 if she cut the fire to embers overnight and burned twisted hay to bridge the gaps. The children had grown thin on rationed food. Her own dresses hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since August, but the walls held, the roof held, the stove held, and the temperature inside the shelter, even on the coldest nights, even when the wind screamed across the prairie, at 40 miles an hour, never dropped below 32 degrees. 32 degrees was survival, not comfort, not warmth, but survival. On January the 6th, 1887, the clouds that had been building for 3 days finally broke. Snow began falling at noon, light at first, then heavier, then a solid wall of white that erased the world beyond the shelter's single window. The temperature was 12 degrees above zero when the storm began. By nightfall, it was 15 below. By midnight, the thermometer Heinrich Brauer had given her, his one concession to her survival attempt, read 34 degrees below zero, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. The storm did not stop on the 7th. It did not stop on the 8th. By the 9th of January, Clara had lost count of hours, lost track of day and night, lost everything except the rhythm of the fire and the sound of the wind. The wind was the worst part. It came from the northwest at 60 miles an hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie, piling drifts against the north wall of the shelter until the stone disappeared entirely. The sound was like nothing Clara had ever heard, a continuous roar punctuated by shrieks and moans as the gusts found gaps in the world and forced themselves through. But inside the stone walls, under the sod roof, the fire burned. Clara fed it every 2 hours now, smaller portions to stretch the dwindling fuel. Cottonwood, cow chips, corn cobs, twisted hay when the other supplies ran low. The stove consumed everything she gave it and demanded more, a hungry iron mouth that stood between her children and death. The temperature inside the shelter held at 38 degrees, cold enough to see breath, cold enough to keep the children bundled in every blanket Clara owned, pressed together for warmth, sleeping in shifts so someone was always awake to feed the fire. But 38 degrees was not freezing. 38 degrees was survival. On the morning of the 10th, Clara thought it was morning. The light through the snow-covered window was gray and directionless. The wind dropped for the first time in 4 days. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise, a held breath that seemed to promise something terrible. Clara wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl and pushed open the door. The world had been erased. Where the prairie had been, there was only white, drifts rising 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet in places, shaped by the wind into frozen waves. The path to the Brauer soddy had vanished. The path to town had vanished. Everything beyond the immediate walls of her shelter had been swallowed by snow and silence. The temperature, according to the thermometer nailed beside the door, was 41 degrees below zero. Clara had never felt cold like this. It burned. It reached inside her lungs and squeezed. Her eyes watered instantly, and the tears froze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. She retreated inside and sealed the door behind her. "Mama?" Thomas was awake, watching her from the pile of blankets. "Is it over?" Clara looked at her fuel pile. A quarter cord of wood remained, perhaps 2 days' worth of cow chips, a handful of corn cobs. "Not yet," she said. "Not yet." The knock came at noon. Clara was so startled she nearly dropped the pot of thin corn mush she had been stirring over the stove. No one knocked. No one could reach her door through 10-foot drifts in 40 below cold. She opened the door. Heinrich Brauer stood on the threshold, covered in snow, his face a mask of ice and desperation. Behind him, barely visible through the swirling white, were 2 small figures, children, his children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4. "The roof collapsed," Brauer said. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "An hour ago, the snow weight. I couldn't." He swayed on his feet. "Please." Clara pulled him inside. The children came behind him, Peter and Gretchen, she remembered, though she had seen them only from a distance. They were shaking so badly they could barely walk. Ice crusted their eyelashes. Their lips were blue. "Where is your wife?" Clara asked, already knowing the answer. Brauer shook his head. She stayed behind. The cattle. She was trying to save the cattle. His voice cracked. I couldn't carry them all. The children. I had to choose. Clara did not ask anything else. She pulled the children close to the stove, stripped their frozen outer layers, wrapped them in blankets from her own bed. Thomas gave up his spot without being asked. Annika pressed close to little Gretchen, sharing warmth. The stone walls radiated heat that Clara had stored for exactly this moment, hours of burning, hours of the limestone absorbing warmth, now releasing it into the bodies of children who had nearly died. How did you find your way? Clara asked Brauer. He was slumped against the wall, his hands thrust toward the stove, trembling. Follow the smoke. He pointed upward, toward the stovepipe that jutted through the sod roof. Only thing visible in the whole white world. Just smoke rising. I walked toward it. His eyes found hers. I didn't know if you would still be alive. We're alive. The roof. He looked up at the sod ceiling, at the charred beams visible between the packed earth. It's holding. Yes. I said it wouldn't. Clara didn't answer. She went to the stove, poured corn mush into tin cups, pressed them into the hands of the Brauer children. They drank like animals, desperate, burning their tongues without caring. My wife, Brauer said, I have to go back. You'll die. She's alone, the cattle. You'll die, Mr. Brauer. Clara's voice was flat, certain. Your children just watched you carry them through a blizzard at 40 below zero. If you go back out there, they'll watch you never come back. Is that what you want them to remember? Brauer stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then his face crumpled, and the man who had predicted her death since August put his head in his hands and wept. The storm resumed that afternoon, wind building from the northwest, snow falling so thick that the window disappeared entirely, the world contracting to the 16 by 20 space between the stone walls. 7 people now, 7 bodies in a shelter Clara had built for 3. The fuel calculation changed. At the new burn rate, feeding the stove every 90 minutes instead of every 2 hours, her remaining supplies would last 4 days. Maybe 5 if she stretched the hay, if she twisted it tight enough to burn slow, if she ignored the way the grass cut her hands until they bled. But 7 bodies also meant 7 sources of heat. Clara remembered something she had read once in a magazine back in Philadelphia. Each person generated warmth, 300 British thermal units every hour just by existing. 7 people meant 2,000 British thermal units that the stone walls could absorb and radiate back. 7 people meant the stove could burn a little cooler, the fuel could stretch a little further. The math still didn't work, but it was closer than it had been. On the 11th, the temperature outside dropped to 46 below zero. Clara knew because Brauer checked the thermometer every few hours, reporting the numbers in a flat voice that betrayed nothing. 42 below. 44 below, 46 below. At 46 below, exposed flesh froze in under 5 minutes. At 46 below, a healthy adult could die in less than an hour without shelter. At 46 below, the cattle in Heinrich Brauer's collapsed soddy, the cattle his wife had stayed to save, would already be dead, and his wife with them. No one said this. No one needed to. Inside the stone shelter, the temperature held at 35 degrees, cold, but not freezing, not death. The children slept in a pile near the stove, Thomas and Peter, Annika and Gretchen, 4 small bodies tangled together under every blanket Clara owned. They had stopped shivering. They had stopped crying. They slept the deep, exhausted sleep of survivors who had passed through terror and come out the other side. Clara and Brauer sat on opposite sides of the room, feeding the fire in shifts, not speaking. There was nothing to say. His wife was dead, or would be soon. His home was destroyed. Everything he had built in 11 Kansas winters had collapsed under the weight of snow, and now he sat in the shelter of a woman he had told would not survive to see Christmas. Around midnight on the 11th, Clara had found a candle stub and was marking the hours by its burn. Brauer spoke. "How did you know?" Clara looked up from the hay she was twisting into fuel sticks. "Know what?" "The walls, the sod, the—" He gestured vaguely at the shelter around them. "This? How did you know it would work?" "I didn't." Brauer stared at her. "I didn't know," Clara repeated. "I had a theory. I had stone walls that held cold in summer, so I thought they might hold heat in winter. I had sod houses that people said were warm, so I thought a sod roof might work as well as sod walls. I had nothing to lose and children to save." She bent another handful of hay, twisting it tight. "I didn't know, Mr. Brauer. I guessed, and I got lucky." "Lucky." Brauer's voice was hollow. "I built my soddy with 10 years of experience, proper construction, proper materials, and it collapsed in 4 days. Sod walls weren't meant to hold that much snow weight." "Stone walls were?" Clara looked at the limestone around her, 2 feet thick, solid as the earth itself. "These walls were built by someone who knew what he was doing. I just put a roof on them. A sod roof that you built yourself in 8 weeks, with no help. Margaret Schaffer helped. Martha Lindstrom helped in her way." Clara finished the haystick and set it aside. "Everyone helped a little. No one helped enough to matter except me." Brauer was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "My wife told me to help you. Back in August, she said, 'That woman is going to die unless someone helps her.' And I said, 'She'll die either way. No point wasting effort on a lost cause.'" Clara didn't respond. "I was so certain." Brauer's voice cracked. 11 winters. I knew how things worked. I knew what was possible, and I knew that a widow with $5 and 2 children and no experience couldn't survive what was coming." He looked at the sleeping children, his children, alive because Clara's shelter had smoke rising from its chimney when his own home was collapsing. "I was wrong about everything." "You were wrong about me," Clara said quietly. "You might not have been wrong about much else. I was wrong about what matters. I was wrong about who could be trusted. I was wrong about—" He stopped, pressed his hands against his face. "Elsa, my wife. I should have made her come. I should have carried her. You couldn't carry 3 people through that storm. I should have tried." There was nothing Clara could say to that. She twisted another haystick, set it on the pile, started another. The stove crackled. The children breathed. Outside, the wind screamed across a frozen world. On the morning of the 12th, the door shook. Not the wind. The wind had been shaking the door for days, a constant pressure that Clara had stopped noticing. This was different, rhythmic, desperate, pounding. Clara grabbed the axe she kept beside the stove and approached the door. Behind her, Brauer was on his feet, positioning himself between the sound and the children. She opened the door. Martha Lindstrom fell across the threshold. She was barely recognizable, her face white with frostbite, her lips cracked and bleeding, ice in her hair, ice in her eyelashes, ice coating every inch of her clothing. She was not wearing her coat. She was not wearing gloves. She had come through the storm in nothing but a house dress and a shawl, and the only reason she was still alive was that Clara's chimney smoke had given her something to walk toward. "Fire!" Martha gasped. "My house! Fire!" Clara dragged her inside, slammed the door against the cold. Brauer was already stripping Martha's frozen outer layer, wrapping her in the blanket he had been using for himself. "What happened?" Clara asked. Martha's teeth were chattering so badly she could barely speak. "Chimney. Caught. Tried to put out. Couldn't. Whole house. Burning." She laughed, a terrible sound. "Burning. In a blizzard. At 40 below. Whole house burning." "Did you get anything out?" Martha shook her head. "Nothing. Just me. Saw the smoke. Your smoke. Walked toward it." Her eyes found Clara's. "You were right, you know. That ridiculous roof. You were right." Clara pressed a cup of hot water into Martha's hands. Just water. Nothing else. They were rationing everything now. "Drink this. Slowly." "My house is gone." "Drink this." Martha drank. Her hands shook so badly that water sloshed over the rim, but she drank. 8 people now. 8 people in 320 square feet. 8 people with fuel for 3 more days. The storm continued through the 12th and into the 13th. The wind never stopped. The snow never stopped. The cold never relented. Inside the shelter, Clara instituted rationing that went beyond anything she had planned. 1 meal a day, corn mush stretched with water until it was barely more than flavored liquid. The stove burned at the lowest possible level, just enough to keep the temperature above freezing, just enough to keep the children's breath from crystallizing in the air. The stone walls helped. They had absorbed 6 days of heat before the storm began, and now they released it slowly, steadily, a thermal reservoir that supplemented the struggling stove. Even with the fire at embers, the walls radiated enough warmth to keep the temperature at 31 degrees. 1 degree above freezing, 1 degree between survival and death. Brauer and Martha took turns feeding the fire. Clara twisted hay into fuel sticks until her hands were raw and bleeding, until she couldn't close her fingers, until she had to wrap them in rags and keep working anyway, because stopping meant dying. Thomas helped. His 8-year-old hands were steadier than Clara's by now, his fingers nimbler, his technique, twist, fold, twist again, perfected through days of practice. He didn't complain. He didn't ask when it would be over. He just twisted hay and stacked fuel sticks and watched the fire with the intensity of a child who understood exactly what was at stake. On the morning of the 14th, Clara counted the remaining fuel. 1/2 quart of wood, 1 basket of cow chips, 47 hay sticks, 2 days. Maybe 3 if she cut the fire even further, if she let the temperature drop to 28 degrees, if she risked the children's fingers and toes to frostbite in order to survive a few more hours. "It's not enough," Brauer said quietly. He'd been doing his own calculations, watching Clara count, running the numbers in his head. "Even with the walls, even with the bodies, even with—" He shook his head. "We're short." Clara knew. She had known since the 2nd day, since the Brauer children arrived and changed the arithmetic from difficult to impossible. "How short?" Martha asked. She was recovered enough to sit up, to speak without her teeth chattering, to understand the mathematics of survival. "1 day," Clara said. "Maybe 2. We'll run out of fuel before the storm runs out of cold." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the pile of sleeping children, a small voice. "Mama?" Annika was awake. Her 5-year-old face was pale but calm, watching her mother with eyes that held no fear. "Mama, can we burn the chairs?" Clara stared at her daughter. "In Philadelphia," Annika continued, "you said people burned furniture when they ran out of coal. You said grandmother's neighbors burned their chairs one winter. Can we burn the chairs?" Clara looked around the shelter. They had no chairs. She had never acquired furniture beyond the bare necessities. But in the corner, stacked against the wall, were the wooden planks she had used to build the door frame, the salvaged lumber from the Hendricks barn, the remains of her ladder. Wood, dry wood, burning wood. "We can burn the ladder," Clara said slowly. "We can burn the door frame. We can burn the planks." She calculated quickly. Another day, maybe more if we're careful. "That still leaves us short," Brauer said. "It leaves us less short, and the storm has to end sometime." Martha laughed, a real laugh this time, rough but genuine. "You've been saying that for 5 months, haven't you? It has to work sometime. Winter has to end sometime. The storm has to stop sometime." "It hasn't stopped being true." "No." Martha pulled her blanket tighter. "No, it hasn't." Clara picked up the axe. The ladder came apart in 12 minutes. The door frame took longer. She had built it too well, fitted the joints too tightly, and now she had to work the axe into gaps that didn't want to give. But by afternoon she had a pile of wood scraps that would feed the stove for another 36 hours. 36 hours, plus the remaining fuel, plus whatever desperate measures came after. It would have to be enough. The storm broke on the morning of January 15th, 1887. Clara woke to silence. Real silence, not the false quiet of wind-deafened ears. And for a moment she thought she had died. Then Thomas stirred beside her, and Annika coughed. And Heinrich Brauer said, "God in heaven," in a voice that held something Clara had not heard in 9 days. Hope. She pushed open the door. There was no door frame anymore, just a makeshift barrier of planks she had not yet burned, and stepped outside. The sky was blue. Not the pale, threatening blue of impending storms, but a deep crystalline blue that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. The sun hung low in the east, casting long shadows across a transformed world. The drifts were mountainous, 15 feet in places, sculpted by wind into impossible shapes. The Brauer soddy, visible only as a depression in the snow, had completely vanished. The town, 300 yards away, was buried to its roof lines, and everywhere, the snow sparkled in the morning light like scattered diamonds. The temperature was 22 below zero. Still deadly cold, still dangerous. But the wind had stopped, and the snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, and Clara stood in the doorway of her stone shelter and breathed air that did not burn. Behind her, 8 people emerged into the light. The children blinked against the brightness, their eyes unused to anything but firelight and shadow. Martha Lindstrom leaned against the door frame, the planks, the makeshift barrier, and stared at the wreckage of the world she had known. Heinrich Brauer walked a few steps into the snow, stopped, turned back. "It's over," he said. Clara shook her head. "It's stopped. That's not the same thing." She was right. The cold would continue for weeks. The drifts would take months to melt. The work of survival, finding food, finding fuel, rebuilding what had been destroyed, was only beginning, but they were alive. All 8 of them. Alive in a stone shelter with a sod roof that everyone had said would fail, heated by a cracked stove that everyone had said couldn't be fixed, kept warm by walls that everyone had said couldn't hold heat. Alive. The town emerged from the snow over the following days. 19 people had died in the storm, 13 from cold, 4 from collapsed buildings, 2 from a fire that spread when a stove was overloaded. The Brauer soddy was a total loss. The walls crushed under the weight of snow, everything inside frozen solid. Martha Lindstrom's frame house had burned to the foundation, nothing salvageable but the stone chimney that still stood like a monument to failure. Of the 23 families in and around Russell, 17 had survived in their own homes. 3 had sheltered with neighbors. 3 had lost everything and had nowhere to go. Elsa Brauer's body was found on January 17th, buried under the rubble of her collapsed home. She had died trying to save the cattle, died within sight of the barn, within steps of shelter, killed by cold so vicious it had frozen her upright. They buried her in the frozen ground 3 days later. Heinrich Brauer standing silent by the grave, his children holding his hands. Edwin Polk, the land speculator, did not appear at the funeral. He had left for Topeka before the storm, missing the blizzard entirely, and would not return until spring. When he did return, the Hendricks ruin, the pile of rocks he had offered $8 to buy, would be the most talked about structure in the county. The validation came slowly, then all at once. Heinrich Brauer was the first. He came to Clara's shelter on January 20th, 5 days after the storm broke, carrying a bundle of firewood he had scavenged from somewhere. She didn't ask where, didn't want to know whose destroyed home had provided the fuel. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara was mending a tear in Thomas's coat, her needle moving with the mechanical precision of exhaustion. She did not look up. "You owe me nothing. I told you that you would die. I told you this shelter wouldn't work. I told you." He stopped, started again. "I was wrong about all of it. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to protect myself from having to watch you fail." Brauer set down the firewood. "It's different. What you built here, the stone, the sod, the way the walls hold heat, I've never seen anything like it. 11 winters in Kansas, and I've never seen anything like it." Clara set down her needle. "It's not complicated. The stone absorbs heat. The sod holds it in. The stove does the rest." "If it's not complicated, why didn't anyone else think of it?" "People did think of it. The stone buildings in Hayes, the sod houses everywhere on the prairie. I just combined them." Brauer shook his head. "You didn't just combine them. You saw something the rest of us missed. You saw that stone walls without a proper roof are stronger than a proper roof without stone walls." He looked around the shelter, the blackened limestone, the earthen ceiling, the patched stove still radiating warmth. "You saw that survival doesn't require doing things the right way. It requires doing what works." Clara didn't respond. She picked up her needle and went back to mending. "I'm going to rebuild," Brauer said. "Not a soddy this time. Stone walls. Sod roof. Like this. Will you show me how?" Clara looked at him, the man who had predicted her death, who had refused to help her, who had stood by while she struggled alone because he was so certain she would fail. He was asking for her help now. He was admitting she had been right. "Yes," she said. "I'll show you." Martha Lindstrom was next. She appeared the following day, recovered enough from her frostbite to walk without assistance, her face still mottled with healing skin, but her eyes sharp and calculating. "I'm going to rebuild too," she said without preamble. "My husband's frame house was a death trap. Always was. I just didn't know it until I watched it burn." She studied Clara's shelter with the assessing gaze of a woman who had learned to evaluate everything. Stone walls, sod roof. How much did it cost? Clara thought about the question. $5 for the ruin. Nothing for the stone. It was already there. Nothing for the sod. I cut it from the prairie. The labor cost me blisters and exhaustion, but I don't think that's what you're asking. Materials only. What did you pay for materials? The iron cement for the stove. 2 cans. I traded labor for them. Clara paused. The stovepipe joints. 25 cents each. The tar paper for the roof. I didn't have any. That's why it leaked before the snow sealed it. Martha nodded, calculating. Under $10? Then, for a shelter that kept 8 people alive through 9 days of blizzard. Under $10 if you already have the walls. The walls are the expensive part. Martha looked at the limestone around her. Unless you know where to find stone cheap. The fence post limestone. It's everywhere out here, just below the surface. The Germans around Hayes quarry it themselves. Martha's eyes narrowed. You're telling me I can build walls like these from the ground up? Without buying stone from a quarry? The Germans do it all the time. The stone is soft when it's fresh from the ground. You can shape it with hand tools. It hardens after it's been exposed to air. Clara set down the coat she had been mending. I can show you, if you want to learn. I want to learn. Martha didn't hesitate. I also want to know why you're offering. I wasn't kind to you last year. I doubted you. I said you were a fool. Clara remembered. The charred timber, the skeptical questions, the prediction that she would collapse the roof and kill herself. You also gave me corn cobs when I needed fuel, Clara said. You told me about Margaret Schaefer when I needed help finding iron cement. You weren't kind, Mrs. Lindstrom, but you weren't cruel either. Martha laughed, a sharp bark of sound that held genuine amusement. My husband used to say, never trust anyone who's all kindness. At least a difficult woman will tell you the truth. Your husband said a lot of things. He was a drunk and a fool, but he wasn't always wrong. Martha extended her hand. Teach me to build, Clara Vogel. I'll teach you how to survive a Kansas summer. Fair trade. Clara shook her hand. The word spread. First to the German families around Hayes, who already understood stone construction but had never thought to combine it with sod roofing for maximum thermal efficiency. Then to the settlers in Ellsworth and Lincoln counties, who sent representatives to examine Clara's shelter and ask questions about dimensions and materials and techniques. Then to the newspapers, which ran stories about the stone widow who had survived the great die-up blizzard in a shelter she had built herself. By March, Clara had shown her methods to 14 families. By April, 5 stone and sod shelters were under construction within 20 miles of Russell. By summer, the German Catholic communities had adopted the hybrid design for their outbuildings, and a mason in Victoria was offering to build Vogel-style cellars for anyone who could pay. Clara shared everything freely. She drew diagrams in the dirt, explained the principles of thermal mass to anyone who would listen, walked farmers through the process of quarrying limestone and cutting sod. She charged nothing for the information, not because she didn't need money, but because information was not something that could be owned. The stone was free. The sod was free. The knowledge should be free too. You could make money from this, Martha Lindstrom said one afternoon in May. They were sitting on Clara's doorstep. She had rebuilt the door frame, properly this time, watching the children play in the spring grass. Patent the design, charge a fee, something. Clara shook her head. I didn't invent anything. Stone walls have existed for thousands of years. Sod roofs have existed for centuries. All I did was put them together and get lucky. Lucky? Martha snorted. You built a shelter that kept 8 people alive through the worst blizzard in Kansas history, and you call it luck. I call it survival. Survival isn't something you patent. Martha didn't argue further, but Clara noticed that whenever someone new came to learn the methods, Martha told them a slightly different story than Clara would have told. In Martha's version, Clara wasn't lucky. She was brilliant. She had seen what no one else could see, built what no one else could build, survived what no one else could survive. Clara never corrected her. Stories, like survival, belonged to whoever needed them most. Edwin Polk returned in June. He drove into Russell in the same polished buggy, wearing the same clean suit, looking exactly as he had the day he had offered Clara $8 for her ruin and promised she would freeze to death. He found Clara in her garden. She had one now, a small patch of vegetables behind the shelter, and stood at the edge of it without speaking until she looked up. Mrs. Vogel, he said. Mr. Polk, I understand you had quite a winter. Clara wiped dirt from her hands. I understand you missed it. Polk's jaw tightened. I had business in Topeka. A man can't control the weather. No, he can only control whether he's prepared for it. They looked at each other across the garden rows. Polk was the same man he had been in August, the same calculating eyes, the same predator's smile. But something had shifted in the power between them. Clara stood in the shelter she had built, surrounded by the vegetables she had planted, and Polk stood at the edge of her property, asking permission to enter. I came to make you another offer, Polk said. I'm not interested. You haven't heard it. I don't need to. Clara picked up her hoe. My shelter isn't for sale. My land isn't for sale. My methods aren't for sale. Is there anything else? Polk's smile flickered and died. You're making a mistake. I've been making mistakes my whole life, Mr. Polk. Building this shelter wasn't one of them. She went back to her hoeing. After a long moment, Polk turned and walked back to his buggy. Clara did not watch him go. Clara Vogel lived in her stone shelter for the next 34 years. She never rebuilt it into a proper house, never added rooms or windows or any of the improvements that other settlers made as the years passed, and the prairie became less wild. The stone walls and sod roof that had kept her alive through the blizzard of 1887 remained essentially unchanged, patched, and maintained. Yes, but never fundamentally altered. She raised Thomas and Annika to adulthood in that single room. She buried Margaret Schaefer in 1892 and Martha Lindstrom in 1903. She watched Heinrich Brauer rebuild his life, remarry, raise 3 more children, and become the most vocal advocate for stone construction in Ellis County. She never remarried. She never left Kansas. She never forgot the 9 days in January when 8 people huddled around a cracked stove and survived by the grace of stone walls that should not have worked and a sod roof that everyone said would collapse. Clara Vogel died on March 15, 1921, at the age of 73. She was found in her shelter, her home, sitting in the chair that Thomas had built for her 40th birthday, facing the stove that had kept her alive. The fire had burned down to embers, but the stone walls still held warmth. On the morning of January 6, 1887, the sky over central Kansas had been clear and mild. Temperatures hovered above freezing. Children played outside without coats. Farmers spoke of an early thaw, an easy winter, a season that might finally show mercy. Heinrich Brauer, who had survived 11 Kansas winters, had walked to Clara Vogel's shelter that same morning. He had looked at her stone walls, her sod roof, her meager fuel pile, and he had delivered his verdict. A woman alone can't prepare for winter out here, not with 2 children to feed. You'll freeze to death in that pile of rocks, and those children will freeze with you. He had been so certain. His experience had been so deep. The mathematics of survival had been so clearly against her. 3 days later, the blizzard began. 9 days later, 8 people walked out of a pile of rocks that everyone said would fail. They walked into a morning of crystalline blue, their breath pluming white in the 22 below air, alive. The stone walls stood for another century after Clara's death. They stand still. If you know where to look, 4 walls of fence-post limestone on the edge of what was once Russell, Kansas, blackened at the top, where the Hendricks fire burned through long ago. The sod roof is gone now, replaced and replaced again, and finally left open to the sky. But the walls remain 2 feet thick, holding the cold in summer and the memory of warmth in winter. A woman alone built a shelter out of a $5 ruin. It saved everyone who trusted it.